Welcome to the book of Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament, but not the last recorded events of the Old Testament. The action in Ezra and Nehemiah actually took place after the book of Malachi. Still, Malachi is a post-exilic prophet, though he doesn't give us a date for when he prophesied. So we are left to follow the clues to figure out just when he was active. Clue number one: Malachi mentions sacrifices and offerings in his book. And this means that he must have been active after the completion of the Second Temple in 515. Clue number two: Malachi denounces many of the same sins that Ezra and Nehemiah correct. Take a look at this. So in Malachi 2, we record that the people had been faithless by marrying the daughter of a foreign god, meaning that they intermarried with the nations around them. Nations like the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, groups with whom the people in Ezra's day took some of their daughters to be wives. And in so doing, it says that they committed an abomination, most likely by worshiping the foreign gods of their brides, their new brides. So that's similarity number one. Similarity number two: in both time periods, Malachi and Nehemiah, the vulnerable, the poor, the widow, the fatherless, they were abused by this post-exilic remnant. And in so doing, both the prophet and the governor says, you're not fearing the Lord. You do these things and you do not fear me, says Yahweh of hosts. And Malachi says, ought you not to walk in the fear of the Lord instead of extracting interest from your brother? Third, they neglect the temple service, specifically not bringing the tithe into the storehouse. And it was only after Nehemiah got in there and shook a bunch of things up that Judah finally brought the tithe into the storehouse. Finally, the priesthood seemed to become corrupt as well. Specifically, their covenant is mentioned. You have corrupted the covenant of Levi, O priests. Malachi condemns them. And Nehemiah says the same thing. You desecrated the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. So what does this tell us? Malachi must have been active between the completion of the temple in 515 and the arrival of Ezra and Nehemiah in 458 to clean up all of the problems that Malachi addressed and pointed out. But we can narrow it down just slightly more than that. Take a look at this timeline. Beginning to like this timeline, I hope. Period in green is the construction of the temple. We have Ezra's arrival down here in 458. So Malachi must have been somewhere in this blue window, but he had to have began his ministry long enough after the completion of the temple for the once exciting sacrifices and offerings to become a weariness. It says that these sacrifices are a weariness. That's what the people complain of. But they wouldn't have done that right after the second temple was completed, and they were so excited about it. So long enough after the completion of the temple, but long enough before Ezra's arrival, because Ezra doesn't mention Malachi. Ezra 1-6 mentions Haggai and Zechariah by name and their role. You'd think that Ezra 7-10 would have mentioned Malachi as well, if he was active pretty close to the arrival of Ezra. So we're thinking Malachi somewhere in this window. The year 470 is a pretty good guess. Well, as you might have guessed, the book of Malachi is not a happy book necessarily. Haggai and Zechariah, they're happy books, sort of. They urge this second temple, this community to build the temple, and they promise God's blessing and his support in that project. And they even look to the coming Messiah if the people repent and reform their hearts to be ready for his coming. But since that time, 20, 30, 40 years have passed, and in the eyes of many, the great promises of Haggai have failed. Haggai says in chapter 2, that God is about to shake the nations and make Zerubbabel my signet ring. And the people in Malachi's day, they're like, about to? In a little while? A generation has come and gone. Haggai, Zerubbabel's dead. There's no king from the line of David on the throne, and we are slaves. Even Ezra and Nehemiah, both in chapter 9 of each of these books, admit to being slaves of a massive Persian empire. They're just tiny little vassals struggling under the weight of crippling taxation and enduring constant harassment from the local peoples. It makes sense then that under those conditions, the faith and certainly the optimism of this post-exilic remnant would begin to waver, and they would begin to question God. God, where are you? And what difference does it even make if we keep your rules anyways? I mean, look at all the evil people around us, the nations. They seem to be doing just fine. And so what started as doubt kind of became apathy, and an apathy which bordered on apostasy. Something had to be done. And so God raised up the prophet Malachi, meaning my messenger, to issue a wake-up call. In chapter 1, verse 7, God says, return to me, and I will return to you. Yahweh shouts this call. But then, for the only time in the Hebrew Bible, the people shout back. You see, Malachi has a very distinct structure. It's designed around 6 disputes, or disputations, many call them, where God makes some kind of claim. He says, I have loved you, O Israel. But then Israel shouts back, and they question, they challenge that claim, asking, in this case, in the first disputation, how have you loved us? And each of these challenges by Israel, they are introduced by the same phrase, the phrase, but you say, in response to what God has said. Let's take a look at how Malachi can be structured around this phrase, but you say. After the Lord makes a claim, Israel challenges that claim. But you say. Again, this is the second disputation. You despise my name. But the remnant says, how have we despised your name? Again, but you say, what a weariness this is. But you say, why does he not accept our sacrifices? But you say, how have we wearied him with our words? But you say, how have we robbed him? When God makes the claim, you are robbing me. You see how this works. However, in this disputation format where there's a claim and a challenge, God is always going to get the last word. And in this larger section, we see God's response to Israel's challenge. Now, this kind of patterned discourse accomplishes a couple of different things. It appropriately confronts the malaise and the attitude of the remnant community. But take a look at the purpose of this disputation format in the words of Old Testament scholar Pamela Scalise. She says that this assertion, question, response pattern is an appropriately aggressive response to the cynical and contentious spirit of the people in that day. It's kind of a wake-up call in that way. However, the rhetorical effect of these questions also opens the audience to the possibility of hearing and accepting the divine word which follows. It's kind of a, come now, let us argue it out, declares the Lord moment, from Isaiah 1:18. Well, let's follow the argument here in the first disputation. So God's first going to make a claim, I have loved you. Israel's going to challenge that claim, how have you loved us? And then God is going to respond. In this case, he says, I have loved Jacob, but Esau I have hated. Now, there's a couple of interesting things with this initial disputation. First, notice how this very brief exchange perfectly encapsulates the indifference and the cynicism of the remnant community, thinking, man, God has abandoned us. All of his past promises of his favor, they mean nothing in light of his present absence in their thinking. But now we got to talk about this love-hate language. Now, you remember way back in the book of Genesis when these two guys, Jacob and Esau, twin brothers, were born? It's in Genesis 25. Look at a little prophecy that is made to Rebekah in that moment, where Rebekah conceives, she's barren, but she conceives twins, and the twins she can feel are just like fighting with each other inside of her womb. And she's like, what is happening? She inquires of the Lord, and he says to her that there are two nations in your womb, two peoples, Israel and Edom. And the one will be stronger than the other. And the older, Esau, will serve the younger, Jacob. Esau is born just moments before Jacob. Now you see how Jacob will be served by Esau for no other reason. I mean, they're still in the womb. They haven't done anything. For no other reason than that Jacob is God's chosen vehicle of blessing through whom the promised seed of the woman will come. This is simply God's sovereign election on display. And so this language of to love is simply covenant language for to choose. I chose Jacob, and Esau I did not choose as my vehicle of blessing. Now, it may not look like it, O remnant community, under the thumb of Persia, but you are my chosen people. The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, it says in Romans 11. You were, and you are, and you will always be my treasured possession. Another Old Testament scholar, Gordon Hugenberger, he observes that God's electing love is vindicated, or it is proven in judgment. So Esau and Edom, they were not chosen by God, but they cemented their position through centuries of opposition and violent opposition to their brother Jacob and the nation of Israel. And therefore, for these centuries of hostility, they will be judged. They shall perish. God will has and will lay waste to Edom. They will perish, but you, Jacob, Israel, despite your present insignificance, you will be preserved, and on the last day, you will be exalted. Do you begin to see how this disputation format invites Israel into the conversation with God, calling them to take their questions to God and then wait to hear his response so they can learn his heart? Well, we're going to continue listening in on these conversations between the rebellious remnant and God next.